So the title of this particular talk is What is in a Name? Subtitled From God is the Primordial Sin to Self-Love is the Law. So I'm going to begin with a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, and it runs like this. Arjuna saw the entire universe divided in many ways, but standing as all in one and one in all in the body of Krishna, the God of gods. So in preparing to speak about the Chiasmata of Austin Osman Spare and his book of pleasure, The Psychology of Ecstasy, it must be known in advance that my reading of Spare is a kind of misreading, perhaps even a misunderstanding, if it is even possible to understand Spare. Yet in misreading Spare, I hope to introduce readers to his book as a book of textual flesh, one that is not only to be taken into one's hands and held, but into one's very being, so that it becomes inscribed on one's own flesh as an alphabet of desire. A book that is misread not only by me, but by you as well, so that in holding and reading the book, you are held and read by it. Spare will always be misread, not because he is opaque, but because he is oracular, using images, illustrations, and words to evoke an otherness that is seldom paid any attention, precisely because one tries to understand it. My hope is to present this otherness, this alterity in Spare's work and in your own psyche, with the hope that you welcome it with radical hospitality, so that it reveals itself as itself without trying to understand its whence or whither. This presentation, this talk, is not an exegesis or a summary of the Chiasmata of Austin Osman Spare, Being and Nonbeing Volume 2, nor is it a kind of introduction, but rather it's more of an invitation. It stands as an invitation to release yourself as you read, misread, hear, mishear, to feel into what Spare called neither, to experience not only the book as a book of pleasure, but your flesh as a book of pleasure, where reading such a book is a very act of self-love. Based on my misreading of Spare's The Book of Pleasure, he asked a question that for me seems to be veiled, and precisely because it hides in plain sight, which is oftentimes the best way to conceal something, especially when the spaces that are occupied by hybrid images and words. He asks, what is in a name? This inquiry is grammatological in nature, as he is exploring a unique naming system, a way of naming almost as imagining, where names are translated into images and back again. This translation is part of what makes the text actually occult, as Spare occults word and image naming and being named. Through Spare's grammatology, which is what I described in the Chiasmata, Spare's words, his logoi, if you will, can be read as images, as chiasmic configurations of an alphabetized imagination. For the sake of the question itself, any grammatology articulated in the book is actually an interrogation of and a response to the question itself, which opens up the possibility for the disclosure of worlds within the question. While the question itself is a single question, it is a question that may be the basis for all questions. Thus, when we ask any question, we are initiating an exploration of the signifiers that comprise the question and the grammatical system that contextualizes it, as if to suggest that the possibility exists that there is an answer or answers to the question itself. This mode of inquiry can only be posed by an inquirer that believes themselves to be in a purely Aristotelian cosmos, which is to suggest a metaphysics of presence that makes it possible to ask, pose, inquire, or suggest. Yet the moment of encounter, as the experientially logically prior to the question, is a space of wonder, where being inhabits a space that strips it of certainty, revealing that prior to any articulation of certainty, pre-existent to any belief about what could or may be true, is doubt in relation to the unknown that unfolds as becoming. Doubt is an infinite space of disbelief as the source of unveiled wisdom, which attunes being to what appears before it, not so much as the somatosensory processes that are transformed into percepts and are experienced as a coagulation of what we call world, but as an entanglement of non-being becoming and being, which is the synesthetic experience of living at the heart of every event, which brings together self and cosmos. So the sorcerer or the magician is actually a bridge between self and cosmos, connecting them, making them interdependent, bidirectional, and even circular. In every sorcerous or magical act, the question that Spare asked, what is in a name, is actually being asked, from the self to the cosmos, and from the cosmos to the self, as the question and the sorcerer are not separate, and the asking or being asked. For Spare, the question itself would not demand an answer or even a response as an enunciation in response to the question. The question is either an invocation or an evocation. Thus, what is in a name suggests that there is something that dwells within the name itself, which is both concealed and revealed by the name. Thus, in Spare's grammatology, naming and illustrating, when dualistically conceived, have different functions, which is not to show correspondence or identity, but what is concealed, or better yet, held by the name or image, which is why his writing, sketches, and illustrations can seem obscure, as he occults both word and image, making his grammatology, what I call Nonbeing and Nonbeing Volume 2, an occult grammatology as part of a participatory epistemology of the flesh. While grammatology is often a critique of writing systems, Spare's occult grammatology is critical through its manner of oracular and artistic expression and does not require another level of analysis or interpretation to indicate what is conveyed through the absences that his work creates. In fact, it reverses or inverts this mode of investigation through its entangled ontologies and emphasis on what is plural and chaotic as opposed to what is singular and whole. One of the fascinating aspects about Spare's work is that it illustrates a series of multiplicities, oftentimes non-congruent, coexisting ontologies which bring together categories of being that are hauntingly beatified by the ugly ecstatic, so that erasures and absences appear as part of the ontological substructures of the words he portrays through his art and writing. If one brings together Spare's ontologies in a non-categorical way, so that they coagulate in and then transgress an Aristotelian cosmology and Linnaean systems, as well as the philosophical anthropologies that are put forward by them, one can describe it as a single ontology, one that blurs the margins between beauty and ugliness, human and animal, man and woman, divine and diabolic. His ontology is one that actually severs being's head, as the primacy is placed on a type of forgetting and the intentional repression of one's attachment to desirous outcomes, which renders cerebration and intellection inept as an instrument for sorcerous practice. His magical system, his zos qui occultus, is a form of decapitation, where it is actually about sigillizing conscious intention. This is emphasized over and above the creation of individual sigils or sigil making. It is interesting for me that in the Book of Pleasure, he indicates that he offered one method to his foolish devotees out of love. That's a quote by him, which seems to be the actual method of writing or making a sigil. He then goes on to write about what he describes the true method in quotes, which is the secret of thought form and, again in quotes, what exactly is in a name. Chiasmata of Austin Osman Spare is almost entirely dedicated to describing the secret of thought form through an occult grammatology that unveils a participatory epistemology of the flesh, which is actually a response to the question, what is in a name? This is what I write as the method of sigillizing perception, transforming it, restoring it, returning it to its primacy as a way of experiencing the world in a synesthetic sort of way. Any act of doing magic then is a type of performance, is disarticulated the point of a kind of rending or tearing, disclosing it as an impossibility, as a projection based on a metaphysics of presence that is fundamentally dualistic in its articulation of what amounts to an illusion, with its bifurcated reality divided between seemingly oppositional or adversarial forms. In a strange way, there is no doing or performing in Spare's system, because he dispenses with the ontology, metaphysics, and mythology upon which doing or performing is made possible. When sigils are not just created, but perception itself is sigillized, experience undergoes a transformation so that space and time are both changed, as they are perceived and experienced through a vacuity that voids separateness. Perception and experience flow from a reality that is revealed as a metaphysics of absence, one that includes not only becoming and being, but non-being, constituting an archetypal chiasm as the basis from which a sorceress or magical identity can arise. Here, ontology and archetype intersect as the foundation for a new understanding of space-time, affecting the way the magician or sorcerer inhabits such a space, which is not a space where one acts or performs. In volume 2, I describe this space as being Hecatian in nature, which is an ontology of Hecate's deific form as a goddess of the crossroads. Here it is important to disclose that I am not describing the goddess's ontic characteristics or associated mythologies. Rather, I am describing her form as a structure, as a description of the unique way her aspect as crossroads goddess transforms becoming, being, and non-being as an existential phenomenological relationship to temporality. Becoming, being, and non-being intersect at a 0 point, the Nullpunkt in German. As a whole, the becoming, being, non-being intersection is a self, a type of cosmic soul that is the very essence of every phenomenon, a self that I have described as the Hecatian self. This self is immanent to every phenomenon, but also transcends every phenomenon at the same time, with this kind of relationship being one of transcendence and immanence, not either or. And Spare's occult grammatology, it is neither, which is neither this, neither that, but thisness and thatness. Spare's occult grammatology is a way of inscribing an epistemology, a way of co-creating knowledge that demonstrates the ontological nature of flesh and desire, as integral to a psychology of ecstasy that actually utilizes repression, where repression is not viewed as a Freudian defense mechanism, but as a sorcerous practice that materializes desire, permitting it to take shape as poiesis, thinking being through the becoming of non-being, which only becomes as a result of being forgotten. Here, any relationship to desire includes its forgetting, so that it is not remembered as such. When occulted, forgetting is an oracular form of letting go, or in existential phenomenological terms, releasement. For the philosopher Martin Heidegger, one cannot know or fathom that which is truthful until one is released to the truth, which is the disclosure or revelation of being. With this notion, forgetting, repression, desire, and releasement intersect, so that it's not only a specific desire that is forgotten or released, but the self, where the self is negated, transmuted from being to the void as non-being, so that it be realized as a fuller disclosure of truthfulness, so that temporality is a revelation of the intersection as a whole. Spare's true method as the sigillization of thought forms via oracular presentations, representations, a poiesis of image and word, where image and word become entangled, include the between states or conditions that infuse the spaces that being conceals, as understood through the grammatological systems predicated upon presence. as a shying away from the void that actually stands behind being, often rising from it, turning it and twisting it through crooked paths that illuminate a darkness that blackens being through an alterity or sorcerous otherness that is abjected as the non-inclusive other. Spare's occultus, his system of magic is a sorcery of the X, which is the somethingness that once was but is no longer, revealing the once was as an ecstasy that transgresses being. It is a path of the opposer, a path of the adversary, the path of Cain, a path that welcomes rejection, only to manifest it as being's excess, as entanglements of forms, muddying all categories of thought, inverting subject and predicate, subverting the very cosmos that is created by the categories themselves and experienced as that which is real. It is by this path that Spare can boldly claim God is the primordial sin. The radicality of this statement has not been fully appreciated, fathomed, understood, or experienced, as the consequences for psychological integration would serve to transform most of our psychological, spiritual, and metaphysical beliefs into traces or absences. God is the primordial sin is even more transgressive than Nietzsche's God is dead. While Spare as an occultist and artist is most often known for his introduction of and use of the terms Chia, neither, self-love, and the inner woman, as a type of philosopher in the tradition of Nietzsche, without separating him from his occult and artistic traditions, his word or verbum is God is the primordial sin. In actuality, the occultist, artist, and philosopher are not separate identities that form Spare's identity, but themselves identities that have as their basis the neither thisness nor thatness that situates Spare and the in-between, as a dynamic identity or collectivity of identities that are always in motion, always in flux, changing and mutating in response to his own self-affirming experience. With Nietzsche's declaration, God is dead, it made him, according to Martin Heidegger, the last metaphysician, one who actually pushed God beyond the metaphysical boundaries that circumscribe divinity, transforming God into a kind of excess. God as the meta-signifier, as the beingness of beings, as the foundation for meaning-making, was and is no longer. For Nietzsche, though, this was an unfathomable event, with God casting a kind of shadow that would be felt and experienced for quite some time before what he called the creators and innovators of new ways of living and being came forward, being born from the ashes of the divine name that once was. After Nietzsche, one cannot return to a philosophy, psychology, or spirituality that is predicated upon a metaphysics of presence, which is synonymous with saying God. God is totality and the totalizing function, where all beginnings begin with the word as an indication of something that existed alongside of an inceptual moment. Nietzsche's word was an inceptual moment in and of itself, being a declaration that was oracular without being prophetic in a predictive sense. Spare's God is the primordial sin is a word that suggests that God still is and that God exists, but exists in such a way that he is the primordial sin and has the being of sinfulness. Spare's word is adversarial also to the biblical God is love, and both adversarial and complementary to God is dead, with God is love being a theological statement and God is dead being a kind of metaphysical statement. God is the primordial sin is neither theological nor metaphysical, and is itself neither, kind of logos or law, existing as the between and none. Nietzsche's word, God is dead, suggests that God moves from being to non-being, but never to return to being through becoming. In essence, God will never again become, and can only be known, experienced, and felt as an ecstasy, if you will, of what once was, where God as transcendent being no longer exists or stands outside of the world. God is not and will never be. Thus, he is no longer present, nor will he be future. God is put under erasure as part of a post-death of God epistemology and grammatology. Theologically, God is love suggests that God's identity is that of love, so that love and God are synonymous. Thus, when God is there, so is love. There can be no God without love, and no love without God. God's being is experienced and felt whenever and wherever there is love. Yet what then is love? Ultimately, Spare transgresses God with self-love being the law or logos, indicating that where God is, self-love is not. Hence, how can one love God when God is love? Would this then be the same as saying that we are to love love? Spare's logos, God is the primordial sin, indicates that in loving God, one misses the mark and therefore sins. On a deeper level, God sins against himself by being God, requiring no action that would constitute sin. Through existing, God is sin and primordially so for Spare. Through an occult grammatology, we can chiase, if you will, John 1:1, rendering it as, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and this Word was sin. So God for Spare can be an event, an inceptual moment, but as sin. God as word or logos is sin, and therefore a law that infuses the world with word becoming nature. Hence, in God creating the world, it is done so through the law of sin. What could be implied through reading Spare's occult grammatology is that the Bible would be a history of sin and a revelation of sin. In the Book of Pleasure, he goes on to say that all religions are evil. All laws based on religion are evil because they ultimately replace self-love with a belief in God, which for Spare is evil. As understood through the neither, religion would be neither good nor evil. And looking closely, though, at Spare's psychology of belief, it is important to have what he described as true belief. With true belief, paradoxically, one must let go of all beliefs and believing in general so that the mind becomes empty or vacuous. One only then can desire manifest as a living belief, being an expression of self-love. Belief itself is sigillized, therefore purging the mind of all beliefs. We can then shift Spare's death posture from being a technique to an existential relationship with self, others, and world, so that self-experience, encounters with others, and engaging the world are void of beliefs, which is a type of a phenomenological epoche. The aspirant, if you will, to manifest desire has to let go of all beliefs, including a belief in the power of the sigil, releasing even intentionality, therefore emptying the mind. In volume 2 of Being and Nonbeing, an Occult Experience, I describe this as being an existential space that the sorcerer inhabits, standing in the null point of the Hecatian self, which is to stand at the crossroads of becoming, being, and non-being. The Hecatian self puts forward a unique phenomenology that allows the sorcerer to experience and feel into the between as intersections. These types of intersections are found throughout Spare's work and are expressions of Chia. While this can be appreciated through his art, it can also be appreciated through his writings, as he writes to evoke and invoke instead of facilitating comprehension. In fact, one must let go of comprehension, understanding, as a way to fall into the void, if you will. The sorcerer has to fall before they can stand, letting go, abandoning the self as the self, voiding it for the sake of being able to hold the word. Spare's logos, God is the primordial sin. This fall before standing and then standing while holding is the existential death posture at the intersection of becoming, being, and non-being, whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. The sorcerer infeels the nullpunkt. In German, this is called Einfühlung or empathy, but it's more than just empathy. It's infeeling or feeling into what I call the 0 point, which replaces knowing with unknowing, knowledge with non-knowledge, which actually decapitates the Ouroboros as the eternal circle, making Psyche the mouth that swallows the tail. This is an experience of pure immanence. Following the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, this is an opposition to transcendence, or that which stands outside of phenomena, which doesn't call into question the existence of noumena, but suggests that noumena don't exist outside of any worldly phenomenon, and as a whole constitute a plane of immanence, where each phenomenon is experienced as an event that infuses the becoming being non-being intersection, with the sorcerer expanding their space of sorcerous practice to include the world as a whole. This Hecatian phenomenology, Spare's participatory epistemology, opposes purely transcendental ontologies and metaphysical systems. Just as there are, though, two aspects to Aleister Crowley's logos, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, and love is the law, love under will, there are two aspects of Spare's logos. We have already explored in detail, God is the primordial sin, all religions are evil. The second part of this is self-love is its own law. Self-love first involves forgetting rather than remembering, entering into a space of emptiness where the mind mirrors the 0 point. And if you recall, an existential death posture that allows the sorcerer to feel into non-knowledge, transforming it into a mystical experience where the flesh becomes the vehicle for a spiritual erotic congress, a participatory epistemology of the flesh that co-creates knowledge through the body, where the body is the margin for the flesh of the world. In essence, it is the point of contact through which a gnosis of the flesh is experienced on a plane of immanence, where all encounters are events through which the sorcerer self-realizes through infeeling the intersection. This experience of non-knowledge is transgressive, but transgressive to the point of transcendence. The mind of the sorcerer is therefore transgressive transcendent, with mystical non-knowledge being experienced to the point of ecstasy, where the sorcerer feels the 0 point so intensely that they feel they are standing outside the self through expanding the self's boundaries, encompassing greater and greater points of intersection. Because the Ouroboros is decapitated, time is felt to move through the sorcerer rather than the sorcerer moving through time. This death posture is a way of being in the world that affirms life, as it positions death in relation to all false beliefs, which is any belief that is contrary to the law of self-love and the eternal return. This reveals the law of Chia at the heart of the cosmos, intertwining with the law of love under will into the simplicity of self-love as two serpents of wisdom. Falling into the void and then standing at the crossroads creates a space for false beliefs to be negated, affirming the circle's eternal return as a passing through the self that stands at the crossroads, loving and saying yes to it. The death posture becomes a stance that is taken in relation to God, passing through God to self-love. As God is a repetition of sin and false belief, the law of Chia is a repetition of self-love and true belief. The sorcerer, through their affirmation of self, sets in motion a kind of methodology that situates self-love in the very place of the ego, infusing the 0 point, the null point for the sorcerer's self that reveals the cosmos as a revelation of self-love. The ego and God are chiased into absences, with the sorcerer's self being a monad, a primeval ego that exists at the very center of every chiasma. Doing here is non-doing, knowing is unknowing, going is non-going, all this pure spontaneous becoming. Headlessness, emptiness, voidness are expressions of the Platonic chora, which I refer to in volume 2. This placeless place, a space of emptiness that is self-transformative, one that self-empties as non-being into becoming and being, is the formless womb of all forms, one that shapes and configures archetypes, worlds, words, and images, rendering them visible from that which is invisible. Translating Cora into Spare's occult grammatology, it is analogous to what he referred to as the inner woman, which is cognate with both Chia and the neither as signifiers. The inner woman is the in-between, revealing between states hybrid forms that are primordial and therefore closer to desire as they participate in the co-creation of what can be known. Experientially, this is synesthesia and ultimately what Spare calls telesthesia, when non-being is made visible and revealed to intersect with becoming and being. As an inner experience, it is a mystical experience of non-knowledge. It transgresses what Lacan would call the symbolic order, moving beyond language, moving beyond the logos, not as an act of pure transcendence, but one that expands the symbolic order itself, stretching the symbolic beyond its alphabetic limitations into a language of the flesh, where flesh is intertwined with desire and cosmos. Spare's alphabet of desire as monograms of thought, which ultimately respond to the question, what is in a name? In a post-death of God occultism, which I describe in volume 2, every incantation, invocation, and or evocation asks and responds to the question, creating a circle that mirrors the eternal circle, imitating it as it moves through the everywhere center. It is the inner woman, the sorceress self, that asks and responds to the questions as thoughts, feelings, and ideas that arise from psyche and revelations from and to the world. The question is inherent to every desire and held in the unconscious, appearing as individual sigils, as monograms of thought, which themselves express and respond to the question, but without answering it. So let's conclude by playing with an idea that Spare offered a true method that differed from the creation of sigils. And this is kind of a meditation, a kind of imagination or active imagination. And so you can just listen along or maybe even close your eyes as I go through this. But I want you to begin by imagining the inner woman as an oracle that Chias's desire. She is not interested in creating monograms of thought, but in asking and responding to the question itself. Here you would release the mind of all thoughts, feelings, and images to the point where it becomes empty, void, experiencing what Spare called the absent mind. Then from this place of absence, from this place of stillness, from the silence, you would allow the name self-love to enter into your awareness. This name is now the nullpunkt, the center of the being, non-being, becoming chiasm. By making it the center, it is now chiased, transforming the chiasm into a chiasm. You exhale and inhale the name, exhaling it as logos and inhaling it as alogos, going back and forth between word and silence. From the space, you trust your intuition as to when to pose the question, with the question being, what is in self-love? Your cycle of exhalations and inhalations is now transmuted into the question, which you repeat over and over again, mirroring the eternal circle. Here, you don't think of the question as a linear sentence, whether horizontal or vertical, but as a circle that turns. Imagine yourself at the center of this circle as the question turns around you. You no longer have to ask the question because the question asks itself. You release any and all responses or answers to your questions, letting them come and letting them go as neither this, neither that. Your existential relationship to the question is the death posture. You are moving from the symbolic to the order of the infinite, feeling into self-love, intertwining with it so that the name becomes flesh. As you feel into self-love, feel it deeply. Imagine it flowing through your body, through your organ systems, your organs at the cellular, molecular, and even atomic levels. Allow yourself to feel any emotion that arises. This is desire, the primordial id, Kia, feeling through you and as you. Know that the entirety of your being is infused with self-love, and so is the cosmos. Rising from this placeless place now, this null point, you carry it with you as the everywhere center, knowing that you are the sorceress self. To know that you are the sorceress self is to unknow everything, to shift from knowledge to non-knowledge, realizing that the world you once believed in is a kind of illusion that was weaved by the primordial sin. From God's ashes, you rise as self-love, letting go of all beliefs until only the true living belief remains. A new world appears before you, one that was always there, one that invites full participation as flesh, where the word of sin is God and the law is self-love. Yeah, it's one of the things that I'm just kind of interested in general is, as I mentioned in the presentation, but also in the book, is looking at ontologies of deific forms. And, as I was thinking about intersections, crossroads, chiasmata, all of those different things, the shape of the X itself, I thought, okay, this is one aspect of the goddess that is really appealing to me from an ontological perspective. So what would it be like to actually take the X, kind of turn it into a type of crossroads and intersect being, non-being, and becoming, and then say, hey, this could be a kind of ontology of Hecate's deific form, which again is, something that's a little different than, looking at ontic descriptions or the mythologies associated with her. So I think in general, and not just with this particular form, I'm fascinated at looking at even other deities from this kind of perspective, looking at them as putting forward very unique types of ontologies and phenomenologies that come from them. Um, First and foremost, I'm very influenced by Derrida, postmodern and post-structuralist thinkers who kind of as a whole have this critique of logocentrism. And, I really wanted to kind of weave these thinkers into a kind of dialogue with occult philosophy. And through my reading, it seemed like in the Book of Pleasure, there are a lot of places where one can really kind of deconstruct logocentrism and kind of move beyond the word, move beyond the logos, and get into these kind of like between places, these silences, these voids, these absences that have their own way and their own unique way of speaking. And I think with a lot of the occult thinkers that I'm kind of looking at, they very much complement in many ways the Western philosophical canon in some ways. And when I'm looking at Spare and his work, there's a lot of intersections between the way he kind of works with ideas, concepts, and images, and people like Bataille and Derrida and things like that. And so I think Spare's work actually complements Derrida. It actually complements Bataille. It helps even them to say things that they couldn't necessarily say using their own language and vice versa. Way they're strange bedfellows, and I'm kind of interested in putting strange bedfellows together in the same sort of bed, if you will. So the thought that for instance, I could bring Lacan to this kind of conversation would be anathema to many people, that would find it abhorrent in some ways. And so, it's one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I think through the good work that is happening at Atramentous Press is bridge building. You know, while a lot of the philosophers and philosophies that you had mentioned, you know, they have been referenced before in relation to occult literature, but some of these other thinkers, not as much. And so when you think about like Merleau-Ponty and Derrida, for instance, who feature quite a bit throughout volume 2, they're typically not mentioned in the same conversation as esoteric or occult literature. And, you know, some people that I've told about what I'm doing from a more academic perspective, you know, they're a little reluctant or resistant to embrace this, but then there are others that are actually quite fascinated by it, and they're hungry for this sort of thing and very interested in this idea of kind of bridge building. And maybe folks from a more academic, philosophical, depth psychological perspective that aren't as familiar with esoteric literature, that may have been immersed in existential phenomenology, you know, might read volume 2 and take an interest in some esoteric literature. And so that is really my hope in some ways, that will happen, to create more of a bridge between the so-called academic and the occult worlds. No, I think that's great. You know, and I like sort of the playfulness that you kind of bring to that reflection. You know, as someone who's trained as a depth psychologist, you know, trained in, you know, Freud, Jung, you know, Lacan and folks like that, as part of my own clinical practice and theoretical background, you know, it was really interesting for me to come across this kind of idea that there can be like an intentional use of repression as a kind of technique, a magical technique, if you will, that would help actually manifest or bring about desire. And so I had a lot of fun actually looking at that and playing around with that sort of idea. And what I really didn't get to in this particular talk, but it's mentioned in the book, is the idea of feminine jouissance, moving from, you know, the symbolic order that Lacan talks about to the infinite order. And both Lacan and Freud didn't really have a lot to say. So in seminar 20 on feminine sexuality is where, you know, Lacan really takes up this idea of feminine jouissance. He kind of in some way just almost like parrots Freud, which is kind of saying like, well, we really don't understand it all that much, but I can kind of liken it to mystical experience, right? And he talks about it in relation to Saint Teresa of Avila. But he doesn't say a lot about that, which I found really fascinating. So I think maybe he didn't have the language to unpack that because he was operating primarily within a psychoanalytic Freudian paradigm. But I think if you turn to Spare, if you turn to Georges Bataille, they have a kind of language for really describing feminine jouissance and also the experience of feminine jouissance. So, and even moving forward with some of this work, I have a talk that I'm going to do here in Pittsburgh that is actually called Occulting Lacan. And so it's much more of an emphasis on kind of taking occult esoteric literature and actually using some of those ideas to occult Jacques Lacan and some of his work. And this is going to be in front of a primary Lacanian academic audience. So I'm curious to know their feedback for that, but it was accepted as a presentation topic. So, you know, they obviously were intrigued by the idea. I think that's spot on. You know, I think whoever made those reflections, I think those are really, really interesting points. And yeah, there really isn't, I mean, there isn't really like a familiarity. You know, Spare really wasn't familiar with a lot of these kind of continental thinkers that I'm bringing into the dialogue. And so certainly, like obviously Nietzsche is someone that we can certainly reference and connect him with. But, when you're talking about like Merleau-Ponty, when you're talking about Heidegger, when you're talking about Derrida, Deleuze, and people like that, for sure, those weren't kind of part of his philosophical foundations for many different reasons. But I think they really, as I said before, they can unpack some of the things that Spare is saying throughout his writings and communicating through his art, and provide a language for him that he didn't necessarily have, to take these profound ideas and concepts and actually further expand upon them. And again, vice versa with Spare and his work, and how he can complement some of these continental thinkers. And so, the whole idea that maybe some people that are listening to this and maybe reading the work want to take this in completely different directions or further expand upon it is fascinating to me. And I'm hoping these astute, intelligent minds, the individuals listening to this, can perhaps do that, because it's further going to, I think, create these bridges between, in many people's minds, worlds that are separate. And so I mean, for me, just as a bit of an academic, I would love to see more of this kind of work, and to see how some of this stuff can inspire other people to do really creative and innovative things. Yeah, I think you're right in saying that there is a kind of lineage, that is formed through those four thinkers, and they kind of build upon and expand upon one another. But there's a way too, like, and I have to say, with the first volume, that there was an intentional kind of heresy in relation to that, in that, of course, one is not supposed to do any kind of commentary on the Book of the Law. And so I thought it would be fun in a way, and it's not really a commentary in kind of a traditional sense, but in a way it sort of unpacks some of the ideas that are present in that book. And so with that volume in particular, it was like, okay, let's begin with Aleister Crowley, his Book of the Law, and let's do something that in some way could be considered even heretical to some. That one would be commenting on this book in such a way, and who's this person to come and actually do that? And so that was part of it in a way, but obviously not the only part and intentionality behind that. But these are obviously prominent thinkers within, contemporary occult philosophy. And they're still very much salient in people's consciousness, with books, reprints by them, books about them, commentaries continuing to come forward. And these are thinkers that really inspire and intrigue me, in terms of my own reading of them and practicing some of their techniques and things of that sort. And so I wanted to dive into something that spoke personally to me, some thinkers that evoked and invoked things for me. And so in a way, it's not so much that, maybe, as odd as this might sound, that I would choose them, but I felt called to kind of respond to these works in such a way. So there's a way in which they were kind of texts that summoned me. And so I kind of feel inspired to work with them in a way, and to kind of look at this lineage, but kind of show that there are different branches that come from this lineage, that can delve into depth psychology, continental philosophy, postmodernism, post-structuralism, to see these branches kind of reach out, and expand these ideas in very creative, innovative ways. Yeah, and in a way, it was kind of a way to transgress orthodoxy. What I found is that a lot of people might use different names, different deities, different gods and goddesses, but there's an underlying kind of fundamentalism that's there. And a fundamentalism can speak through the masks of non-Christian deities, for instance. And there's a way in which, when you're playing around with ontologies of these deific forms, and in particular the one that I did with volume 2, it's kind of it's introducing a new way of experiencing and taking up these deities that might open up horizons for new experiences. So, like with a lot of these volumes, it will evoke something different for each person. And I'm very interested in dialoguing with readers in terms of how the language is used throughout the books evokes different things for them, and how it might help them on their own spiritual paths, for that matter. As a depth psychologist and as a psychotherapist, I'm primarily a healer. And even though like these books might not be intended towards a kind of therapeutics, I'm very interested to hear and to read how some of these ideas might be helpful for people, and how they might move them through places of stuckness on their own psychospiritual paths. Yeah, those were fun to kind of innovate and experiment with, and they're kind of hybrid practices that blend together, at least for me, a lot of different traditions. And a lot of the way that I practice for myself is through a kind of inspiration. And so I really rely on, connecting to sort of a, lack of better terms, like a transcendental kind of source, like an otherness or an alterity that might be within me. So I might, through a type of mindfulness kind of practice, if you will, at least at the beginning, enter into a place of stillness and into a place of silence. And then I oftentimes will see what gets evoked for me. And instead of like letting some of these ideas, some of these thoughts, some of the bases for these practices, just to let them go, I'll kind of follow them and see where they end up going. And with the appendices, those practices in there, and even the one that I kind of introduced at the end of this presentation, these were things that really, I have to say, they come to me in the midst of my own practice as I'm immersed in my own spiritual experience. And so I'm very much in my own practice open to what kind of gets evoked and invoked for me. And it's sort of translating or transcribing images, ideas, or thoughts that enter into my own psyche. And with these practices, that's really how it happened. Then, of course, once they come into your head, and as they're evolving through your own practice, once you put them down on paper, you end up doing them yourself and just kind of seeing how they work. And through my own experimentation, I thought it would be nice to offer them as an adjunct or a supplement to this text to show that, yes, these are complex, philosophical, even abstract ideas, but there's a way that these ideas can be translated into different types of practices. So this is a translation in many ways of the theoretical underpinnings of the book itself into practical sorts of things that people can do and play around with. I'm very playful with practices and things like that. I approach them with a kind of levity, sort of a non-seriousness. One of the things I like about the way Alan Watts, for instance, describes meditation, he just describes it as the art of doing nothing. And if you think about that, like, that's incredibly radical. Like, so many people have a hard time like doing nothing. So it's not mindfulness or meditation or practice for the sake of anything. You're just doing it just to do it. Sure. So yes, volume 3 is in the works. It's kind of an outline form, and I'm working on that now. I've also recently completed a manuscript, which is a revised and expanded version of my dissertation on the psychology of Eric Graham Howe, and kind of looking at primarily the Druidic influences in his work. With a tentative title to be called a Druid in Psychologist's Clothing. And I'm very excited about that one. And there's a possibility that could come out in the near future. So that's certainly one to look forward to, in addition to volume 3 of this series, which is again anticipated, intended to come out next year at some point. And the plan with the Being and Non-Being series is that there to be a volume that gets released every year. So we're looking at volume 3 possibly next year, and volume 4 the following year, and that would complete this as the series as a whole. And then, you know, move on to other projects. You know, if people are interested in, you know, connecting with me, I will certainly throw out my email address. I don't know if it'd be better to try to write it down. I don't really know how to do that, but it's, I'll just go ahead and say it. It's Ian Edwards, PhD @gmail.com. And I'm also on Instagram as Ayin Yesh, AYIN YESH 31. And so you can certainly follow my Instagram account. I've got different postings on there, and I try to post some things every week. It's a mixture of occultism, Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy, and depth psychology stuff. It's meant to be read, so I write in short little chapters intentionally, because I know that for a lot of people, like holding a 500 or 600 page book can be daunting. So I know for me, like I look at some of the books that I've like, I'm never going to read those, but they look great on my shelf. But short little books and short little chapters can be read fairly easy, almost as meditations. And so if a chapter is 3 or 4 pages long, for instance, or even maybe up to 8 pages, that's doable. You know, one can read through chapter by chapter, one chapter at a time, and really meditate on the chapter itself. And so the actual length of the book, short chapters, is very much intentional, because my hope is to actually produce a book that people will read, whether they like it or not. I want them to read it. And so a book that's under 200 pages is readable. Thank you both. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.